Next, we have House Bill 220, Public Safety Militia Active Duty Combat Maryland Defend Our Guard Act. Billy Grammer, how are you?
How are you? Good to see you. I have
Nice
two
to
people,
see
if I
you.
could bring them up as well.
Actually, bring everyone, whoever you want.
Just the two, please.
Sounds great.
Should I get started?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair, Madam Vice Chair, members of the committee. For the record, Delegate Robin Grammer here to present House Bill 220, the Defend Our Guard Act. House Bill 220 limits the use of Maryland's militia to constitutional deployments. The event in my life that was most politically formative for me was the terrorist attacks of 9/11. Our country experienced radical policy changes thereafter. 9/11 was also the impetus of one of our country's largest and most recent military engagements, the war in Iraq. The Project for the New American Century, a neoconservative think tank, had lobbied for regime change in Iraq since the 90s. 10 of its members landed in the Bush administration. After 9/11, these people argued that we must invade Iraq due to its growing cache of weapons of mass destruction. No stockpiles of weapons were ever found, nor was any active program found for their development. It was also argued that Saddam Hussein harbored and supported al-Qaeda. The 9/11 Commission proved this to be false. What we did see is regime change in Iraq. As we look back at major conflicts of the last several decades, such as those in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we consider our policies as we face what will be a protracted conflict between Russia and Ukraine, we should think very carefully. To me, the most important reflections on our military engagements are given by those returning from deployment, such as the stories told by veterans returning from Afghanistan. These men and women talk explicitly about increasingly politicized military leadership, mission creep, and a lack of direction in military decisions. Most Americans are likely unaware that in addition to Afghanistan, U.S. troops have recently seen combat in Mali, Nigeria, Kenya, Somalia, Yemen, Syria, and Iraq. These burdens of these conflicts lay squarely on the shoulders of our sons and daughters. Many veterans suffer greatly from these conflicts. Thousands suffer loss of life or limb, carry the baggage of post-traumatic stress syndrome, or other mental health issues. When one of your constituents shares a Facebook post performing 22 push-ups, they likely do so with thoughts of a friend or family member who suffers from post-deployment mental health issues. We should also note that deploying troops to another country leaves us without support at home. House Bill 220, the Defend Our Guard Act, which has been sponsored in more than 40 states, attempts to deal with this problem. It does so by limiting the deployment of Maryland National Guard to its constitutional deployments, including declarations of war, deployments governed by Titles 10 and 32. Justifications for our foreign engagements should be clearly defined so that both the public and our service members understand what their goals are. Our service members should be guided by clearly defined victory conditions. Mission accomplished should be a predefined goal, not a banner to stand in front for a political victory. Our participation in wars that last decades and the public lamentations of broken veterans who question their purpose are indicators that policymakers should bring our deployments back to our constitutional bounds and that our Congress members need to do their jobs. The only war that our country should engage in is one that our Congress members should put their mark on. The historic principle is that military conflicts voted on will be more well thought, more clearly defined, and more succinct. We should defend those who defend us. With that, I'd be happy to take questions, and I ask for a favorable on House Bill 220.
Thank you. Who will be next?
Good afternoon. My name is Scott Spalding. I'm favorable for HB 0220. Good afternoon, Chair, delegates. Thank you for your attention. I'm testifying today because I'd like to take a moment to spend time discussing the real costs of war. Not in dollars, not the $6 trillion in counting, but the human costs. When I was a student at Towson University in 2006, after my first deployment, I was in class with a ghost. There was a young man in class who bore an uncanny resemblance to a man who I had helped put in a body bag. So I withdrew from that class. I can't take this moment without recognizing that my passion for this cause is driven by the Iraqi family I shot to pieces in 2004. The family who lost an eye, or the baby who lost an eye to our bombs in 2004, and the Afghan 7 years old whose legs were blown to pieces by a mortar in 2014. If they're still alive, they're the same age as my students at Parkville High School who hail from Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and Somalia, where our troops are in combat. My knowledge of their languages brings us together at times, but they don't know that I can't unlearn how to say stop or I'll shoot. I can't forget. It's the first thing I think of when I want to say stop to them, stop doing this. If today we hear someone speak about money or lost funding, I want you to think about the costs borne by others like me and the 37 million refugees of these wars, including those new young Marylanders. Some speculate that if Maryland passes Defend the Guard or some other state does, there may be retaliation by or Congress reducing our state's budget. My father, a retired Vietnam veteran and DoD civilian, retired, is concerned that the Guard might punish me for being outspoken on an issue that they fear could affect their budget. I could be naive, but I don't believe Congress or my chain of command are that malicious. Besides, Maryland's Guard has done its duty. Would Congress be more willing to have no Guard at all than simply perform their constitutional duty to us? There's no wrong time to do the right thing, and I'm asking you to stand up for democratic leadership of our military. Representative Raskin, then state senator, I wish him a speedy recovery, supported similar legislation in 2009 and 2010. This bill is not a referendum on any particular war or war in general, but it's a demand that democracy be the process by which our country goes to war. In one speech Senator Raskin gave, he used one of my favorite quotes from Abraham Lincoln. He had said that the provision of war-making powers was placed in Congress because kings had always been involving and impoverishing their people in war, pretending that the good of the people was the cause. The current state of affairs places the president where kings had always stood. Please remember the real ongoing costs you've heard and weigh them against any speculative dollars. Remember that when you're discussing this bill, no amount of dollars can bring my friend back to his orphaned twin daughters who he never met. Think of my students in Parkville. Sorry. When I was in Iraq and Afghanistan, they would have been infants, and it could have been them. They know I've been to their countries, and we share the emotional cost of these wars every day. Lastly, remember, we're simply asking that the people, through their elected representatives, lead the military as it is keeping with the democracy. Thank you for your time.
I want to thank you, before we go on to the next witness, to thank you on behalf of the committee for your service, and thank your family, and we appreciate you sharing your personal story, okay?
Thank you.
It matters.
I'm sorry.
You don't have to be sorry. We respect you, and we're grateful to you. Who's next?
It's me. Hello, I'm here to speak in favor of House Bill 220 as a regular citizen. So I think that the central tenet of the bill, that the National Guard should only be used when Congress has declared war, is part of the constitutional duty of that body, is a good tenet for a bill because the National Guard has been overused and abused, and that hurts our country and it hurts Maryland. When they're away in different skirmishes, because it's hard to call it war when it's not been declared, then they're not available in our state for emergencies and for what that they're designed to do, for national emergencies and for things that come up here. Also, it's a great bill because it has bipartisan support. It's not Democratic or Republican to want our National Guard here and available to us when we need them. As well, it doesn't interfere with the ability of the governor or the president to address national emergencies. Some other important, I want to speak more on behalf, because I'm not part of the military, on why we need them in Maryland and how it affects Marylanders. For example, like in Oregon, when the National Guard was sent to Afghanistan, they weren't available to deal with wildfires at home. In Louisiana, being in Iraq, they weren't available when Katrina happened, or when they were in Syria and then COVID started. And then coming back, when they're brought back and then have to immediately address emergencies in their state, this creates burnout and low morale. As well, now, people that are in the military. No.
You can finish. Go ahead.
Okay. People in the military and National Guardsmen tend to be service-oriented individuals that have jobs as first responders and teachers, and these jobs are left vacant when they're away for months at a time. Business is shuttered, and so another reason that we need them here.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. We appreciate you as well. Are there any questions for this panel? I don't see any questions. Thank you very much for
Thank
your
you.
time. Thank you. Again, thank you, sir, for your service to our country. Next, we have, actually, the rest of the witnesses, which are a lot, are all virtual. So I ask the committee for a little patience while we bring them up. We're going to bring 4 at a time. They're all favorable, and we'll see how that goes, okay? And those of you that are waiting for the last bill, thank you for your patience as well. Don't worry, we will pay attention, okay? Let's get started with, let's see. Mr. Laurel, we can't hear you yet because your audio is processing, so just give it a minute. Are the other ones on? Mr. Blitz, are you on?
Yes, I am.
Oh, good afternoon. Will you be so kind and get started, please?
Sure.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, Vice Chair, members of the committee, I'm Eric Blitz. I serve as the chair of the Libertarian Party of Maryland, and we strongly support HB 220. This Defend the Guard legislation is part of a movement in over 40 states to rein in the federal government's practice of using state National Guard units in undeclared and unconstitutional wars. These are the kind of wars that last a generation, have meandering or improper goals and justifications, are entered into under false premises, and cost tens of thousands of lives. They are the kind of wars that continue merely out of inertia, regardless of whether strategic goals are being achieved and regardless of the costs in lives and money. This bill should have bipartisan support that focuses on the benefit to your constituents who serve in the Maryland Guard. Despite engaging in many armed conflicts, the United States hasn't declared war since 1941. As a result, every war since World War II has been more controversial and less effectively waged. Declaration of war requires political consensus to be built for the mission and acts as an important check on the executive branch. Lately, the practice has been to rely upon statutory authorizations of military force. These AUFs stay on the books well after the hostilities that justified their passage have ended and give the president a blank check for new military use. Currently in Congress, there's legislation to end the AUMFs that were passed in 1991 and 2002. These decade-old authorizations were used as the legal justification for the use of military force in 2020. And that's notwithstanding the fact that the Gulf Wars were long over and that the purposes that were used, or justifications used to pass those legislations had expired. That is not what our Constitution requires, and AUMFs are more often used as a method to avoid political accountability than to establish legitimacy. We ask you to protect the members of the National Guard. We ask for a favorable report on HB 220.
Thank you for your testimony today, Mr. Blitz. We really appreciate it. Next, we have Mr. Travis Lerell. You have to unmute yourself. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for calling me. I'm Travis Lerell. I live in Anne Arundel County. I served in the U.S. Air Force for 8 years, both active and reserve. And today I'd like to talk to you about my time in the 70th Intelligence Wing on Fort Meade, Maryland. I was on the Airmen's Council to hear complaints. On my very first day on the job, we had a young airman come in and request that his deployment be canceled. He discovered that his wife was pregnant and his deployment time resulted in missing the birth. And he had a natural desire to help his wife during this time and see this child be born. The Air Force denied this request. This request was the first of many I saw, and most of which were denied. But I never saw anyone come in to complain about not being deployed. It was always the deployment that was the problem. See, we talk about the cost of war in lives and dollars, but there's also the everyday human cost. Deployments break up relationships. I've seen men promising attempts at college degrees. I've seen them break up small businesses that veterans were trying to create. There is always a toll paid in relationships and one's life being put on hold. And sure, sometimes sacrifices need to be made. Everyone serving understands that. But if the situation calls for such sacrifice on behalf of the men and women serving in the Maryland Guard, surely it's not too much to ask our Constitution to take the vote, to ask our Congress to take the vote the Constitution requires. That seems like a very reasonable ask, and I hope you all vote favorable on this. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for your service to our country, and thank you for being with us. Next, we have Stacy Wolfson.
Hi.
Good afternoon. You can get started.
Okay, thank you. I'm speaking today in support of HB 220, Defend the Guard. I'm a Baltimore native and a passionate Democrat in favor of peace. I'll admit that until the 2016 election, I was pretty ambivalent about political matters in general, and I was pretty apathetic in particular when it came to foreign policy. But if the last several years have taught me anything, it's that I'd like to see Congress step up now more than ever to ensure that we stay on the right path. As a Marylander, I'm proud to see that our state has the opportunity to lead by taking a step in the direction of ensuring this becomes reality when it comes to foreign policy. As the wife of a Purple Heart Marine veteran who is finishing his service in the National Guard, one of my biggest fears is that a future president will send my husband overseas to fight in a war that I do not support, perhaps over something as small as a tweet. Growing up, my understanding was always that Congress declared wars, the national military fought them, and our state's National Guards were at home to protect the people of their states. I have since learned this has not been the reality for many years. I am in favor of this bill because it pushes Congress to once again take on this role, and that makes me feel like my wishes are better represented than they would be by any given president. If Congress is not willing to declare war, then I don't think it's right that the National Guard should be deployed to support a war it doesn't endorse on my behalf. Going into year 3 of the pandemic, I think this is more relevant than ever. I got my COVID vaccine at M&T Bank Stadium with the National Guard helping out, and I want to know that they're here should another disaster befall us. So as a Democrat and a Maryland, to me, voting for this bill is a no-brainer, and I hope you think so too. Thank you.
Thank you for your time. We really appreciate it. Are there any questions? Seeing none, thank you so much. Next, we have Jessica Katzenstein. I don't know, did I pronounce it correctly? You can feel free to correct me.
Nope, that was absolutely correct. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. I'm here to speak also in support of House Bill 220. I am a PhD researcher. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University. I did my research on U.S. police reform based in Baltimore. I'm also the author of a report for the Cost of War Project at Brown University on police militarization. And I'm here today to speak on one piece of this, the benefits of this bill, which is to ultimately minimize the conflict the U.S. is involved in worldwide, therefore reducing the costs of war on domestic policing. I'll touch on 3 of those costs today. One, of course, is economic. U.S. taxpayers have spent tens of billions of dollars at minimum on military-originated equipment, militarized trainings, and surveillance technologies for police since 9/11. No study that I'm aware of has been able to show that this expense has diminished crime, particularly in poor neighborhoods of color that bear the brunt of both police violence and broader disinvestment in their communities. This expense, it's important to note, also entails massive opportunity costs. Every investment in drones, armored vehicles, and surveillance systems are dollars denied to education, infrastructure, and renewable energy. A second cost is increased violence. Militarization, incurred partly through our wars abroad, may encourage police aggression and violence, particularly against Black people at home. For instance, one study found that even when controlling for civilian demographics, violent crime rates, and rates of drug use, 1033 program, the DoD's program that transfers military equipment to US police, these transfers correlated with increased police killings of civilians. And finally, the militarization that is a consequence of our wars abroad also produces an erosion of police legitimacy at home. Studies have shown that overt militarization in the form of SWAT raids and protest policing often breeds fear and mistrust, especially in Black, Indigenous, and poor communities. As many officers themselves would agree, this can obstruct crime solving and undermine community policing efforts. So for these reasons, I encourage you to support House Bill 220. Thank you.
Thank you for being with us today. Are there any questions for this witness? Seeing none, thank you so much for being with us. Next, we have Carter Hill. Good afternoon, Mr. Hill. Will you be so kind and unmute yourself and give us your testimony?
Thank you, ma'am.
My
Good
pleasure.
afternoon. My name is Carter Hill, and I'm a representative for Defend the Guard in Delaware, as well as the treasurer for the Libertarian Party of Delaware. I served in the United States Marine Corps Infantry and spent about 18 months total in Iraq from 2003 to 2005. We're approaching the 20th anniversary of the unconstitutional invasion of Iraq, so the timing here is fitting. At one point, my team was tasked with locating several mass grave sites where Saddam's loyalists brutally murdered men, women, and children. The image of a child's skull with a perfectly round hole in the back of it will forever be seared in my mind. I've watched families forced to identify the remains of loved ones by fragments of clothing that still remained. I've seen the horrors of tyrants. I've also witnessed the horrors of what our own troops are capable of when they're led to believe they're fighting for a just cause. Have you ever seen a person looking out the window of a bus as you're driving down the road? Now imagine they're trapped inside, grasping the struts on either side of the window, screaming in agony. Now imagine that bus charred completely black and its windows blown out. Now imagine that person inside the bus looking out, grasping those struts framing the window, screaming in agony for eternity from a stiff, burnt shell of a body. That image, too, will forever be seared in my mind. I have seen the worst horrors of war. Our founders also knew firsthand the horrors of both tyrants and of war, and understood the necessary limits on the latter, despite the horrors of the former. I hope you now understand why they had the wisdom to require the entire congressional delegation to investigate, debate, and determine whether sending our troops into war is a worthwhile cause. I ask that you refuse to ship Maryland sons and daughters from their communities into war zones to perform unspeakable acts of horror in the name of liberty, and to be left with those horrors, in their minds without even the slightest due diligence from our elected representatives. I ask that you return a favorable report for HB 220. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hill, for your service, and thank you for sharing your personal stories. You know, it makes a difference, so thank you very much. Who will be next? How about Ms. Brunehout?
Good
Jacinda?
afternoon.
Yes.
Yes. Madam Chair, Madam Vice Chair and committee members, I'm a civilian in Fulton, Maryland, and I support House Bill 220, the Defend Our Guard Act. Maryland National Guardsmen are indispensable to the health and safety of their fellow Marylanders. They are currently undermanned and fatigued from constant deployment overseas and jumping from one emergency to another domestically. Many of our guardsmen are first responders, medical personnel, educators, and essential workers who are crucial in times of crisis. Taking them away from their families, jobs, and the communities they serve and protect without a congressional declaration of war leaves Marylanders vulnerable. Sending our guardsmen overseas could lead to a Hurricane Katrina-type situation, where Louisiana guardsmen were in Iraq and not in New Orleans when the levees broke. The 10th Amendment of the Constitution solidifies the role of states in shaping national policy. The Defend Our Guard Act would force the federal government to follow what is codified in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. If passed, Maryland can prevent our National Guardsmen from going into combat on foreign soil until a congressional declaration of war has been made. Please join other states in passing the Defend Our Guard Act and help keep Maryland and Marylanders safe. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Are there any questions for this witness? Thank you so much for your time. We appreciate you. Have a blessed day. Mr. Mahare, did I mispronounce your name? You can feel free to correct me.
You were very, very close. It's Meharry. And I thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to the committee. I'm the National Communications Director for the 10th Amendment Center, and we are strongly in support of HB 220. I want to go into a little more depth on these authorizations to use military force that were touched on by a previous witness. An AUMF is not the same as a declaration of war, and it does not pass constitutional muster. In practice, these resolutions authorize the president to decide if and when he wants to take military action. The AUMF passed after 9/11 to authorize the invasion of Afghanistan remains in effect today. Presidents Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden have all used this AUMF to justify independent actions to take military action all over the world. My emphasis on the president's independent action and decision is important, and it gets to the root of the problem with these AUMFs. They flip constitutional process on its head by placing decision-making power in the hands of the president. In effect, Congress tells the president, you decide if we're going to war, and then do it if you want to. This violates the constitutional separation of powers. Congress is supposed to make that determination. Basically, Congress is using AUMFs to usurp their constitutional responsibility to determine whether or not the U.S. should engage in military operations by letting the president make that call. One person should never have that much power. As James Madison put it, the executive has no right in any case to decide the question whether there is or is not a cause for declaring war. It's Congress's responsibility. Passing Defend the Guard will pressure them to do their job, and more importantly, it will draw a constitutional line in the sand and ensure Maryland is not complicit in violating the Constitution. I strongly urge you to pass HB 220, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you for being with us today. Are there any questions for this witness? Seeing none, thank you. I love your poster, Make Art Not War. Very beautiful.
Thank you.
Next, please. Can you unmute yourself? Miss Laurie Calhoun?
Yes.
Yes.
Hello.
Will you be so kind and tell us who you are, and you can start giving us your testimony?
Sure. I'm Laurie Calhoun, and good afternoon. I'm here to speak in support of House Bill 220, the Maryland Defend the Guard Act. In the post-9/11 climate of fear that further terrorist attacks might be undertaken against Americans, both the U.S. House of Representatives and the Senate passed an open-ended authorization for use of military force, AUMF, effectively ceding both their right and their authority to limit the executive's ability to mobilize the armed forces of the United States to fight, kill, and possibly die in wars abroad. Rather than needing to confer with the Congress before sending troops into harm's way, the AUMF of 2001 vested in the president the power of a monarch to wage war at his discretion and according to his own timetable. With the unlikelihood that either the president will cede his war-making powers back to the legislative branch or the Congress will demand that they be returned, House Bill 220, currently under consideration, would provide the restraint needed to prevent the Maryland National Guard from being deployed in combat missions abroad at the executive's caprice by requiring that the U.S. Congress pass an official declaration of war. I support the Defend the Guard Act because National Guardsmen enlisted to serve the country under specific conditions which have been bypassed since 2001. The politicians in Washington, D.C. have abdicated the most weighty of all of their responsibilities, that of determining whether and when soldiers must be sent to fight. Because Congress has neglected their responsibility under the Constitution to serve as a restraint on the war-making powers of the executive, the time has arrived for states to assert their sovereign rights and protect their local guardsmen from reckless and counterproductive deployments, as occurred throughout the past 2 decades of the global war on terror in several different countries for which no mission-specific AUMF was ever ratified by Congress. It is too late to do anything about the soldiers sacrificed in Afghanistan, only to withdraw from that country with the Taliban still in power in 2021. Nor can the tragic loss of guardsmen to suicide be undone. But House Bill 220, the Maryland Defend the Guard Act, will help to protect future guardsmen from such fates. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on this issue.
Thank you for being with us today. Lovely artwork as well. Are there any questions for this witness? Seeing none, thank you for your time. We really appreciate it. Next, we have Mr. Christopher Herrickson. Good afternoon, sir. Will you be so kind and give us your testimony?
Good afternoon, Madam Chairwoman and members of the committee. My name is Christopher Hendrickson, and I'm a former U.S. Army soldier who deployed twice to Iraq from 2004 to 2008. I'm testifying today about HB 220. There are many reasons why this bill, allowing the state of Maryland to better control when and where their National Guard forces are deployed. However, my main reasons for testifying today will focus on psychological damage done to Maryland National Guard members and the larger crisis of massive increases in active duty and veteran suicides. Known statistics from the Watson Cost of War Institute at Brown University demonstrate that approximately 30,000 active duty personnel and veterans have died by suicide since September 11, 2001. A very striking statistic, not only for its large size, but because comparatively, only 7,000 service members were killed during deployments for the global war on terror. Well, really 14,000 because the US lost an almost equal number of American contractors, many of who were veterans themselves. And two, historically, suicide rates for service members and veterans were lower than rates among the general population. Just for comparison purposes, I'd like to point out something rather morbid, and yet I think very key to this discussion. 13 members of the Maryland National Guard gave their lives in American overseas conflicts since 2001. It would be fair to presume then that based on the statistics I just mentioned, that approximately 65 members of the Maryland National Guard would have killed themselves in the same time period. That's not simply 13 lives lost or 13 families destroyed. That's 78 lives lost and 78 families destroyed. Now, a host of factors play a role here to include both general aspects of military deployments, such as high exposure to trauma, stress, military culture and training.
You can finish your thought. It's okay. Go ahead, continue.
Thank you. Continued access to guns and the difficulty of reintegrating into civilian life. An aspect specific to the post 9/11 era of combat, which includes a huge increase in exposure to improvised explosive devices, IEDs, an attendant rise in traumatic brain injuries, and modern medical advances that have allowed service members to survive these and other physical traumas and return to the front lines in multiple deployments. All we're asking is for Congress to place their names on the line before Maryland National Guard forces are forced to place their lives on the line. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your time. We really appreciate it. Are there any questions for this witness? Seeing none, thank you for being with us today. We really appreciate your time and your expertise. Okay?
Thank you.
My pleasure. Mr. Otto Dason, did I pronounce it incorrectly?
That's fine.
How do you pronounce it?
Dassen.
Dason? Yes, good afternoon. How are you?
Good. Thank you for giving this opportunity to speak. My name is Otto Dassen. I know you've been hearing from several other voices on this topic that might carry more weight than mine, as I've never served our country. But this bill is extremely important to me, being a son of a recently deceased Vietnam veteran. Although he was drafted, this bill wouldn't have protected him. But his experiences were the same as the veteran fighting in another undeclared war and the trauma that they endured, as you've heard in such testimonies earlier. It's the same trauma I witnessed in my father experienced decades after.
Can I ask you, can you get a little closer to the microphone? You're coming in and out. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. My headphones are not the best.
It's okay. That's
that
better.
better?
Are you
Okay.
driving or are you pulled over? Are you?
I'm pulled over. I'm
Okay,
pulled
great.
over, so-
Just want to make sure you're safe, but go ahead. Give us your
Yes,
testimony.
I'm sorry.
It's okay.
So, although this bill wouldn't have protected my father who was drafted, it would have protected guardsmen who experienced the same trauma that he saw in fighting overseas, and the same trauma that I witnessed in him growing up with the slight sound of any loud noises, he would set him off and trigger him. And that's just something that I noticed as a kid and that I experienced from him. And I just would like to really consider passing this bill. And I just wanted to thank you all for your time.
Thank you for your time and for, sharing your experiences, okay? We really appreciate it. Are there any questions for this witness? Thank you so much for your testimony today. Drive safely, okay?
All right, thank you.
My pleasure. Our pleasure. Are there two other witnesses waiting? I know they were not on there earlier, and that is Jim Bovard and David Swanson. So those are the two that are left. Are they waiting? They're not waiting? Okay, since they're not waiting, we're going to actually conclude the testimony on House Bill 220. Thank you for being with us today. We appreciate it.